Alright, ladies and gentlemen, this is the last big review video for Unit 5. We're looking at political participation, right? How do people actually get connected with the policy-making process? How do they participate? Why do they participate? We're going to be looking at all those factors, and we're really going to be focusing on linkage institutions. This is about a quarter of the exam, so it's a pretty big amount of the exam, right? So I would say, like, when you're studying, if you know kind of the basic constitutional principles, and you know the structure of government, and you really know what we're doing in this video, right, the linkage institutions, and you're going to be in a good shape, right? I focused really on units 1, 2, and 5 you're studying. That's going to be the most kind of bang for your buck, if you will. So what do we need to know, right? We're looking at voting, why people vote, voting behavior, linkage institutions, political parties, interest groups, third parties, how interest groups influence public policy, presidential election, electoral college, Congress. And we're also looking at, right, the campaign organizations and strategies, campaign finance, and the media, and changing media environment. So there's a lot that we're covering here. We're not going to be able to cover every single detail in this video, but what we are able to do is really kind of synthesize what this unit is about, right? How do people actually connect with the policymaking process? So let's take a look, right? We've got groups of people, they want to influence the policy-making process, right? And so what we're going to be focusing on here is how do these different linkage institutions, right, connect people from, like, in ordinary people, any people, right, to the halls of power, to Congress, the presidency, and the Supreme Court, right, and actually influence policy-making outcomes. So if we're looking at the kind of factors that influence political behavior at the kind of individual and aggregate level, we're looking at a couple of different things, right? So why do individuals want to participate in politics? Well, one of the things that political scientists have found is that there's certain correlates, right? People with more resources, time, money, and civic skills tend to be more participate more in politics. People with higher levels of interest, knowledge, efficacy, and partisan identity all lead to more political participation, and people who report that they were actively recruited tend to obviously be more participatory in politics, right? None of this is particularly surprising, but the idea here is that political participation is generally correlated with socioeconomic status and education, right? The wealthier you are, the more educated you are, the higher social status you have, the more likely you are to participate in politics in some ways. And this makes kind of certain rational sense, right? If you don't have a lot of excess time or excess income, right, or if you don't have a lot of information, or you don't have a high level of political efficacy, the opportunity costs of participating are going to be much higher, which means you're much less likely to participate in politics. But we can also look at kind of social explanations rather than the individual level explanations, and this is the idea of Robert Putnam's idea of social capital, right? This is the collective value of people's relationships and social ties, right? And he finds that people who are involved in civic organizations, who are members of a church or synagogue or a mosque, people who are members of community organizations, clubs, various, different different kind of associations, block parties, things, even like knowing your neighbors, right? That all of that correlates to higher level of civic engagement, right? If you have a stronger attachment to the people around you, you're more likely to bear those higher opportunity costs and actually engage in politics. Now, why this matters is, right, we're trying to see how these people, once they're mobilized, once they're kind of decide to engage in politics, how can they actually affect the policymaking process? That is, we're asking how do they actually lead to changes in laws, Supreme Court decisions, presidential actions, administrative actions, right? And the people don't really make the laws themselves, right? We live in a representative democracy, so the people choose the people who then make policy decisions or appoint those who make policy decisions, right? And so we're interested in the different ways that people get connected to the formal decision-making bodies, to Congress, to the White House, to the Supreme Court, or the federal judiciary more broadly. The most obvious way that this can happen is through elections, right, where we choose the representatives, the senators, the president. And so what's important to note here is that According to the Constitution, electoral rules are set by the states. That means that each state can determine like ballot eligibility rules, the format of the ballot, register when you have to register in order to be able to vote. Can you register the same day? What information do you need to register? Early voting rules, absentee voting rules, whether or not you need a voting ID, right? All of these are set by the individual states, right? So kind of the rules around voting are going to differ widely from state to state. Now, we're also looking at different types of elections here, right? On the one hand, we have primary elections. These are the elections that are intended to select the candidates, right? Now, some of the primaries are open primaries, also called jungle primaries, where they're just like the first round of the general election, and they narrow down the candidates to a smaller pool. California, for example, has a jungle open primary versus closed primaries where you're really limited to party membership, right? So that you're trying to select the nominees of that party, right? So in a closed primary, party activists are going to have a bit more influence. Where in an open primary, it's a little bit more all over the place. Another result of an open primary is you could, in certain states, end up with like 2 Republicans or 2 Democrats running for a statewide office, right? Generally, primaries are going to have a more partisan electorate, especially in closed primaries, but also in open primaries, because the opportunity costs of voting in a primary election are going to be higher. There's just way more people involved. The heuristics don't work out the same way that you would in a general election. To vote in an extra election means you probably care a lot more about politics, which means you probably have more stronger partisan affinities, right? Or more, I don't want to say extreme political views, but you're more likely to have kind of like be strongly liberal or strongly conservative. General elections when we choose the actual winners, the president, the senator, etc., right? And these are governed by the idea of the median voter theorem, right? So the idea behind the median voter theorem is that generally the candidate who issues are closest to the median voter in the electorate is going to win. Now, this is assuming that the distribution of ideology in the electorate is normally distributed, so that most people are within 2 standard deviations of the median voter. If that's not true, right, it can create all sorts of issues, right? But regardless, the idea here is that candidates, once they make it out of the primary, which is going to be a more partisan electorate, they're going to move towards the center, right? Because they're going to try to appeal to moderates, to independents, to moderates from the other party, right? While still retaining their own ideological wing. Now, there are different kind of elections, right? Presidents are elected via the electoral college, right? So it is important it's not a nationwide popular vote in all states except for Nebraska and Maine. The candidate that wins the popular vote in that state gets awarded all the electoral votes for that state. Nebraska and Maine, in addition to statewide races for 2 statewide winners for 2 of their electoral votes, they also break it down based on the winners of individual districts. Presidential elections tend to have more turnout than midterm elections because the issues are more salient, they're more nationalized, right? The president commands a national agenda, where midterm elections tend to have lower turnout rates. Midterm elections are every 2 years, where you're voting for every member of the House of Representatives and the third of the Senate. When people are deciding how to vote, right, they might be looking at a couple of different things. They might be looking retrospectively, right? Am I better off than I was 4 years ago? Or they might be looking prospectively and trying to evaluate candidates and thinking about the future. A lot of times, people are voting for pocketbooks, right? They're looking at, is the economy doing well or not? If the economy is doing well, they might vote for the incumbent party. If the economy is not doing well, they might vote against the incumbent party. There's also kind of straight versus split ticket, right? How much do people vote consistently all down the ballot for one political party or not? Now, elections aren't the only thing that's happening here, right? Campaigns are also trying to influence the policymaking process and they connect people to power, right? Because campaigns are kind of the inverse of the elections, right? They're trying to persuade voters to vote in a particular way. So campaigns really are trying to persuade voters and get people to vote. Now, there's little ability, especially in highly polarized electorates like what we have, for a political campaign to get you to kind of switch from being a steadfast Democrat to a steadfast Republican just by the power of a campaign. This does happen in critical elections or realigning elections, but there's usually some sort of exogenous shock that's happening. Now, if we're looking at modern political campaigns, they become increasingly professionalized, increasingly nationalized, right? Even for like local and statewide races, a lot of times national political issues dominate. Part of this is like the role of campaign finance, changes in campaign finance. Part of this is the role of the broader 24-hour media environment and the kind of growing nationalization of politics. And part of it is this idea of candidate-centric campaigns, right? Where it's really about the candidate and not so much the party platform that's happening. So if we're talking about campaign finance, we're really looking at 2 Supreme Court cases. Though there are other ones as well, right? Buckley versus Vallejo, which said that money equals speech, and Citizens United versus FEC, which said the corporations are people. And together, these two cases basically allow for almost unlimited amount of soft money donations by individuals, corporations, interest groups, labor unions, right? All able trying to fund these 527 groups known as political action committees or PACs, right? That are able to, as long as they're not coordinating with the campaign, basically raise and spend unlimited amounts of money on issue ads and campaigns. Now, there's still limits on what you can give directly to a candidate, but you can kind of give unlimitedly. You can spend millions and millions of dollars through these 527 groups, right? And so kind of fundraising really comes to dominate campaigns. Almost as soon as candidates are elected, they're having to kind of start make fundraising calls. But ultimately, campaigns can't really change fundamentals, right? If there's an economic crisis, if there's an economic recession, right, that's going to be bad for the incumbent party. If there is there's going to be certain just kind of cycles of dissatisfaction in midterms against the president's party, right? And a lot of times campaigns are going to have effects on the margins, but they're not going to kind of like running a really great ad or running a really great campaign speech is not really going to sway the electorate as a whole. So if we're looking at political parties, this is the next linkage institution, and these are basically, we should think of political parties as problem solvers, right? They are solving collective action problems. How are we going to get people to actually run for office? How are we going to raise money? How are we going to run campaigns? How are we going to nominate candidates? How are we going to get people out to vote? How are we going to organize elected officials in governing, right? Political parties offer ways to solve all these problems by creating a kind of organization with a leadership structure, with a kind of a way to recruit and nominate candidates, with a way to raise money, and all of these kind of things, right? They also allow for solving information problems, right? Because the information environment of politics is super complex. Party ID becomes an easy way to sort down which candidate am I more likely to vote for. If I'm more likely to identify with Republicans, I don't necessarily have to research a bunch of the candidates. I can just vote for the candidates that identify as Republicans. Now, we have, in the United States, a two-party system, and this is where we have Republicans and Democrats, and this is based on the idea of Duverger's law, in which winner-take-all elections, that means that there's single-member districts, there's no prize for second place, plus first-past-the-post elections, right, where you do not need a majority of the votes, you just need a plurality, tend to produce two-party systems. Now, this isn't universally true, but it tends to produce a two-party system. However, that doesn't mean that the two parties have always been the same. We've had a series of party systems throughout the United States that kind of shift around critical elections, right? So if we look briefly at American history, the first party system, right, from the founding to about 1828, and with the election of Andrew Jackson, was dominated by the Democratic, Republican, and Federalist, but really dominated by the Democratic, Republican parties. From 1828 to basically the Civil War, you get the second party system where the domination of the Jacksonian Democratic Party over the Whig Party, with 1860 through about 1876, 1880 or so, depending on where you exactly want to draw the line, you get the kind of the split between the Democratic and the Republican Party running on a free soil platform, the Democratic Party really dominating the South. Then the fourth party system, this is the Gilded Age, right? This is like the 1880s, 1890s, up through 1932 with the election of FDR, in which you have kind of like basically Republican domination, except with the exception of people like Grover Cleveland and Woodrow Wilson here. And the issues are really so much around like business interests versus kind of like agricultural interests, and you have the rise of the Populist Party out west. You also have like really harsh debates kind of over tariffs. The fifth party system is the kind of New Deal coalition. It's 1932 through 1968 with the election of Nixon, or 1972 with the aftermath of Watergate, depending on where you want to actually draw those boundaries, right? This is the kind of realignment of the Democratic Party as the liberal party, kind of the limited kind of attractiveness of the Republican Party in the aftermath of the Great Depression. And then you have the sixth party system, right, with the resurgence of the conservative movement and the capture of the Republican Party by the conservative movement, in which you can kind of see the Democratic Party controls the coasts and large cities in the Midwest and Northeast, and the Republican Party controls the South and the kind of the plain states in the Mountain West. Now, we can also draw a distinction between strong and weak parties. After the contested 1968 Republican and Democratic conventions, there was basically a shift away from strong parties, where the party convention really involved a lot of horse trading, that winning a bunch of primaries didn't guarantee that you would be the presidential nominee, but those were really contested conventions. And people felt, and a lot of people, ordinary people, felt that their issues and their voices weren't being represented in the nominating process. And so there was nominating reform after the 1968 electoral cycle that really basically empowered the primaries and limited the power of party elites to kind of do the backroom deal, smoke-filled rooms, to choose candidates. However, political scientists have argued that the party still ultimately decides, right? That the party elites, even if they can't formally control things, they can focus around things like endorsements and fundraising to really ensure that their chosen candidates get elected, right? But you can look at the 2016 election, right, where kind of you have two different outcomes, right? The Republicans nominated an outsider with no government experience that was like not really trusted by party elites in Donald Trump, where you had a similar outsider running against party elites in Bernie Sanders, where the Democratic Party was basically able to insulate the party from the Sanders insurgency, right? So we might have weaker parties now, but we definitely have stronger partisan attachment, right? We've talked about polarization already, but the idea here is that people's party ID becomes this kind of dominating thread. So the next interest or linkage institution we're looking at is interest groups. Now these are very similar to parties in that they're trying to solve collective action problems, right? That they are groups organized around specific issues or in a specific affinity, right? They might be organized around like an issue, right? The environment, firearms, Israel advocacy, or they might be organized around groups of people, right? They might be a labor unions, association for ethnic minorities, right? Or retired people, right? But what's key is that they are different from parties in that they don't really nominate candidates, right? They don't really organize the governed, right? They party in office, right? But this is really stemming from pluralist theory and Federalist 10, this idea that, right, people can organize into groups and that they can try to mobilize to influence the governing process. And ultimately, interest groups are trying to solve collective action problems. How can we get a bunch of people that are interested in this issue, connect them to policymaking, right? Get them to actually overcome their inhibitions to acting and actually act, right? They also solve information problems, right? These provide education for members, right? That's one of their key pathways of influence. They can say like, hey, we think that this current candidate is bad. All right, they can try to mobilize their members. Like, look, the Congress is debating in this bill this week, and you should call your congressperson and tell them to vote for or against it, right? Interest groups can also fund campaigns and raise a bunch of money. They can lobby members, right? They can go to members of Congress and try to encourage them to vote in a particular way on a particular piece of legislation. They can also draft legislation and be like, here is the legislation we think you should pass. And they can also engage in litigation. They can sue different groups on behalf of their members. They can file amicus brief with the court, right? So they can kind of influence all different sectors of the policymaking process. Now, the last group that we're going to talk about, the last linkage institution, is the media, right? And the media are all the different kind of ways that we have information about politics, right? This is where we get political commentary. This is also, like through investigative journalism, a way to hold people in power accountable, right? Like, are they actually voting the way that they said they do? Is there corruption? Things like that. Now, the media has some important effects on the political process, right? The media, one of the most important one is agenda setting, right? That the media really ultimately gets to decide what matters and what is salient by what they choose to report on, what issues they cover, what gets put on the front page at the top, what gets headline news and what gets buried in the back of the newspaper, right? What gets talked about during prime time and what doesn't, right? That sets the agenda of what people are going to talk about. And they can also affect through framing, right? How do they frame an issue, right? Are they framing an issue around like economic losses? Are they framing an issue around kind of violence? If there's like a protest, right? Are they framing it around free speech? Or are they framing it around like disturbances to civil order? That's going to affect the way that people think about those issues. And what's really important to think about for the media is how the media environment has changed, right? On the one hand, we have media conglomerates, right? And this is the idea that most of the media that we consume are owned by large corporations. There's 6 corporations really own most of the media, and I'll zoom out so we can see this chart in the background in just a second. But at the same time that you have conglomeration into these large traditional media properties into these large corporations, you also have proliferation of sources on the internet and social media, in which basically anyone can create a website, anyone can disseminate news media, which raises all sorts of credibility concerns, bias concerns, misinformation and disinformation. The other thing is that we inhabit really polarized media environments, and I'm going to show you that in a little bit. So let's just look at first these media conglomerates, right? As you can see, like a lot of these media companies are owned by these large corporations, right? Which is going to probably bias the way that they frame certain things. But this is the Ad Fontes media bias chart, right? That you know and love. As you can see, right, we can look at a lot of the media that we can consume, right? That there's a lot of the media is outside of here. Let me just draw it on the board here. This green box here, which is the kind of both highly credible and not super bias, right? Where it is both highly credible, not super bias form of media, right? So as we kind of move down to the extremes, right, as you can see, like the more biased the media gets, right, the most extreme or hyper partisan on both the right and left, the less credible it becomes, right? But if you look this whole area right here, right, this is a lot of media that people are consuming that is not particularly credible, that is going to be increasingly biased, right? And so you have the challenge of people kind of living in these polarized echo chambers, that they're not able to really consume the media, and they're not really able to see multiple perspectives. They are not seeing the world in the same way as people from other kinds of media are, right? So like if you are not actually living in the same media environment as someone else, right, you're inhabiting a different world, and it's only going to intensify partisanship and polarization. So let's take a look, right? We've got groups of people, they want to influence the policy-making process, right? And so what we're going to be focusing on here is how do these different linkage institutions, right, connect people from, like, ordinary people, any people, right, to the halls of power, to Congress, the presidency, and the Supreme Court, right, and actually influence policy. So another way we can think about the role and the way that these different linkage institutions play is by looking at the three phases of power, right? And this is going back to the very beginning of the class, right? The first phase of power is the ability to mobilize resources to get someone to do what they don't want to do. The second phase of power is the ability to mobilize bias, basically to keep certain people and issues out of the decision-making arena. And the third phase of power is a form of ideological power or social power in which you manipulate values, symbols, traditions, practices in order to shape the way that people think about issues, right? So if we assume, right, that power comes from the people, like we're all good small r Republicans, right, and how that we're looking at the ways in which their influence on the policy making process is mediated, right, between how do we get from the people here to policy A versus policy B, right? How do we draw these connections, right? It's mediated through these linkage institutions, right? People might be mobilizing money, votes, right, to influence who gets chosen by who gets elected to the decision-making body, right? That's going to be mediated by political parties in terms of providing certain collective action and information problem solving. People are also going to organize into interest groups, and those interest groups are going to try to influence who gets elected, right, the outcomes of elections, and they're going to engage in direct lobbying to influence the decision-making body. And that's all forms of mobilizing resources, right? First phase of power. But if we're looking at the second phase of power, there's all sorts of institutional barriers, from voting rules, right, campaign finance laws, the ways in which interest groups tend to represent more wealthy people and issues because they can raise more money, to de Verger's law, which is a result of institutional factors that limits the number of political parties that are really competitive in any given election. But we also might be talking about the media's agenda setting this effects, right? What we are actually going to talk about. That's all in that second phase of power that really provides a big filter limiting out certain issues. Certain issues just are not going to come before Congress, the State House, etc. And finally, right, what issues the people even consider or think about, and how they think about those issues are going to be shaped by media framing and bias, obviously, but also about American political culture, right? This general liberal consensus that we talked about in Unit 4, and also the way that interest groups can appeal to identity claims, right? Like if you, like the NRA can kind of appeal to gun ownership as a particular American value. You can appeal, different family groups are going to focus on the family, is going to frame abortion and other social issues around kind of family values. Religious groups are going to be able to frame these things in different religious identities, right? And they're going to be able to activate those cultural and identitarian cues and influence kind of the outcomes that way. So those are all ways in which kind of the efficaciousness of the people on the formal decision-making body, right? How we actually get between Congress choosing to vote for or against a particular policy is mediated by all these different groups, parties, individuals, media effects, right? And it's not this kind of one-to-one, you vote and then they vote based on what you would do. So if we're like kind of wrapping up, right, Unit 5, right, we're really looking at how can people affect the policymaking process, and how are those effects mediated by linkage institutions. If you feel confident in kind of the roles of different linkage institutions in the policymaking process, then you should be solid for this portion of the exam. All right, I'm going to have some short videos looking at foundational documents and Supreme Court cases coming up next.